Good morning or good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to another layout design video. This one is for an N-scale layout, and the client already has a third planet, and he had already drawn his room into scale, making it a lot easier to get started. I still have to check all the dimensions just to make sure there's no mistakes. Now, I'm assuming this is a basement location. I suppose it could be an upper floor with a balcony out here, but I'm thinking more than likely it's a basement. Anyway, here is the site for the layout. It is around 29 feet long, 9 feet wide at one end and 12 feet at the other, which is a nice big space for an N-scale layout, almost a scale mile long, in fact. Now, right off the bat, he said that the couch could be moved for operation if necessary. I was allowed to use this entire area as long as I left a 3-foot walkway open to the bedroom. And this was one of the few layout designs that I've done for people where there's actually been more space than necessary, and I ended up suggesting that we don't use it all. I drew several layout footprints. Here's a few of them. There's the basic water wings plan along the long wall with the branch line running around towards the bedroom door. Another version where the main line extends around 2 walls instead of just one. And then there's this one that adds a short peninsula into the middle of the room, still with the branch line and plenty of room to walk around behind the couch. And then with what he said about the possibility of moving the couch, we can have a much longer peninsula here if we want to. Now, although he liked the central peninsula, we decided we didn't really need all that space, and we felt it would be much better leaving more space for the family room. So we went back to this version, and this turned out to be plenty of space to get in the sort of layout that he wanted to build. Here is a plan that has the main features of the layout blocked in. He wanted a decent sized yard, and obviously the long wall was the best place for it. It allows for good lengths of trains. Now, he wanted to run a lot of container traffic, so I felt putting a small intermodal yard in this location would be a good idea. He wanted to run unit oil trains, so I suggested the possibility of using this shorter run as an ethanol plant, giving his oil train a destination. And he wanted a branch to a waterfront area that included some street running. And obviously this area along the bedroom wall was going to be the perfect location for that. And then we'd have some kind of small town here with a junction and a few minor industries. Now, he told me it was okay to block the windows while expressing a preference to keep some natural light into the room. And on this plan, one window really needs to be blocked. The other 3 can be left open, so he still gets plenty of natural light. Here is that same design filled in a little more detail. I'll leave this up for a while so you can take a look around at the scope of the facilities included. I've gone with a minimum mainline radius of 20 inches, which scales out to a little over 3 feet for those more accustomed to HO scale dimensions. So plenty big enough to make his large locomotives and long trains look comfortable. I filled the ethanol plant in some detail, although at the moment the structure locations are still in my head. I just wanted to make sure that the rail facilities would fit, and they do. At this time, I also drew in a potential staging yard. For those of you who have not seen many of my layout designs before, I generally feel that it's best to put in as much staging capacity as possible, because one will always fill it out. We have a good sized main staging yard, optional additional locomotive storage at each end, and an auxiliary yard under the peninsula. I also like to put a pair of reversing loops, one at each end of the yard, for ease of reversing trains. And of course, pairs of crossovers at both ends allow for universal use of each track. And usually whenever a lower staging deck is called for, I'm able to get all these facilities in. So let's just go back to the main deck now. When I showed him this plan, he liked most of what I was doing, although at this point he decided that he felt this was too much, and he wanted to take the ethanol plant out and replace it with a river scene instead. Here is the next design that I drew. I haven't done much in the way of developing the main yard. We talked about engine facilities and decided it might be interesting to have the old turntable pit filled in and the original steam roundhouse still standing but repurposed, maybe a private workshop or something. This is something we don't often see on models, and since there's plenty of space for it, and no real need to fill this with track or anything like that, I felt this would be an interesting idea. So this shows how it might fit in. I've shown a river crossing in the scene with the ethanol yard removed. And note how the river takes a turn after passing under the bridge, running along the bench for a few feet before turning back into the backdrop. That way we can arrange the scenery in this area to hide this awkward area. Now this is where the customer started talking about the possibility of an eventual upper deck where he'd run a single track main line through mounting the scenery. So obviously we now need to modify this area to allow space for the helix, just in case he decides to eventually build it, even though designing the upper deck was beyond the scope of this layout design project. Here is this area modified with the backdrop brought forward to allow a helix around it. And of course the yard has to be shortened at this end to allow for the junction, meaning that I'm going to extend it as far to the end as I can without running into the curve. Now that we have the next run used as a scenic area instead of another yard, it doesn't really matter that we're going all the way to the end of the room. And this is what I sketched out for a possible upper deck, with the line coming off the helix, a couple of passing tracks, one here and one over there, and then just ending up in some storage loops under the peninsula. Now there is an alternative possibility here. Instead of having the storage loops in this corner, run the main line around under this passing track and put the loops under the end of the peninsula. It allows for one extra track with the same minimum radius on the inside. And of course all the turnouts can still be along the front edge of the benchwork, grouped together under some removable scenery. And along this wall above the main yard, it would make sense to cut the benchwork back a bit for ease of viewing the lower deck. Although you won't be able to do that with the peninsula because of the need for the curves. But as I say, that was not asked for in the original design spec. It's just something he thought he might want to add later. So here I've drawn in the yard again, back to its original state, but allowed for the modifications in the junction in this area. Now, getting the local freight yard to access either route is no problem, but the intermodal yard is a different story. If I'd wanted it to be fully accessible from the upper deck line, it would have been way too short. This little piece of track that I'm circling with the mouse was where the end of a set of chain crossovers ended up, coming from the single track across the double track into the intermodal yard. And as you can see, there would not have been very much space for it. But since the two outer tracks have a greater than normal track spacing from the main line, it's possible to marry a pair of number 8 turnouts at the ends, extend the turnout curve slightly, and then put a pair of 14-degree crossings over the main line. And by doing that, we save about 2 feet. And also I've kept the approaches to the intermodal yard the other side of the junction, so only one track of the intermodal yard is accessible to the branch line. And we felt that the significantly greater length available in the intermodal yard more than made up for that slight restriction. Also at this time, the river crossing scene has been modified. We talked about making it a vertical lift bridge with a short section of a much wider river just going straight to the backdrop. Of course, now we can't use the shape of the scenery to hide this awkward joint. I suggested that we put a road bridge in. Now, in order to get it low enough to the water to be able to hide it and still justify a lift bridge on the railroad, there were basically two options. Either the road also has to be a lift bridge, or the road needs to be a new construction with the lift bridge on the railroad having recently been abandoned. The control shed would have been boarded up and the lift mechanism welded in the down position. And he preferred the idea of going with a lifting bridge for the road as well. So to contrast from the vertical lift on the railroad, we decided it's going to be a double bascule bridge on the road. And something else he asked for at this point was to get rid of the car float. He wasn't really keen on car float operations and felt that space for additional industries would be preferable. So let's now start filling in some more detail. Okay, starting with the river scene, I've lengthened the approach spans. so that I can move the road further from the river, allowing more structure space, and also more options should he decide to widen the river when he actually builds it. And I've shown a progression of older sections of town to newer, and we thought about the idea of putting a strip mall in this area. A couple of the things that he particularly wanted was a Starbucks, so I put that right in front on an outlot where it can be front and center of the scene. And he wanted a hobby store with an open area outside where he could build a working semaphore signal. So we decided it would be the end store in the strip mall, allowing this tapered space at the end of the building to be used for that purpose. He said that even though it's a fairly modern layout, he wanted an excuse for a working semaphore signal. So now he has it. Now, some of the specific industries he asked for was a sand and gravel dealer, and I thought this area along the aisle would be a good space for that, where the sand and gravel piles can be mostly off stage. And he wanted a steel fabricating shop. I'd always earmarked this space on the plan for a single large industry, contrasting with the numerous small industries that he would have elsewhere. And I decided this would be a good opportunity for his steel fabricating plant. We can see there's 5 spurs here, 3 of which lead into the buildings. I wanted to give him something that could justify switching a handful of cars every operating session. And I showed multiple sheds as those as expanded over time. And then most of the area around here was just earmarked for small industries. The main line disappearing under a city was something that he particularly wanted right from the beginning. This was always going to be here. And he sent me a couple of photographs of other layouts that have done this, showing examples of this feature that he liked. And when he said he wanted street running, I wasn't sure whether he meant having the main line run down the middle of a street or just have numerous grade crossings. So I showed him this and he said, yes, he did like that idea. I haven't yet done any development of the wharf area. I've been just working on the peninsula at this point. And when I sent him this plan, he actually wasn't that enthusiastic. He didn't feel that the steel industry should be so large. He sent me a picture from Google Maps showing a much more low-key industry that just had one track leading into it. And he also wanted the sand and gravel to be more of an indoor industry with silos instead of piles. And he showed me a photograph of that too. So I went into Google Maps, had a look around, and found the 2 industries that he was using as examples. Here is the next version that I drew. It turned out that the steel fabricating plant was a building about 400 feet square. So I've now got 1/2 of a 400-foot building with the one track leading into the corner of it, as in the original plan. And it was a single-story, multi-gabled building, which is what I've drawn here. Now, although the actual industry that he picked out, the spur to it looked like it hadn't been used in months. So he really did have a huge amount of operating potential. But this is the way he wanted it. And of course, he can still make it a much busier facility if he wants to. And I've got another industry in about the same size next to it. If he wants to make it part of the same industry, it can be, or it can be something completely unrelated. And then the sand and gravel dealer, I moved to the harbour. And I copied that building quite closely, although as you can see here, we only have half of it against the backdrop. I've also filled in the rest of the harbour at this point. I put the wharf along the front with a crane. And at this time he'd asked for a fish cannery and a scrapyard. I put the fish cannery in between the main road and the wharf. And it's a fairly narrow space, so there wasn't really room to run a spur down beside it. So I just put the spur at the end and figured they could load with forklifts. And actually when I sent him this, he wrote back and said that that was fantastic because the cannery that he had in mind also did not have a loading dock. And they used 2 forklifts to load the cars. They would use the large one to lift the small forklift into the car and load the ends, and then remove the small forklift and load the middle section with the big one. And of course, this arrangement allows for that to be duplicated exactly. I put in 4 industries along the back, each with their own spur, and then counting the wharf as 1, there's 3 more at the front. So there's 7 small industries in the harbour. And note how the arrangement of the junction town allows for much of the local train to be left here instead of taking everything down the street. The switch crew would only take those cars needed for this area. And we're assuming that not every industry would have cars every day. So it would only be a relatively short train, maybe 4 or 5 cars at the most, that would head down the street. And there are several places where the spurs cross the road, just to make switching really interesting. And this was the look that he wanted. So at this point, much of the hard work has been done. So now let's go back to the whole layout again. Here I have filled in all the scenery and the remainder of the structures. I've brought back the filled-in turntable pit and disused roundhouse from the earlier plan, although here there's only a limited amount of space, so it's against the backdrop. And I've moved his auto-rack unloading spurs to the other side of the main line where they're better, allowing these tracks here to be used for extra well cast storage, which was the original intention anyway. And then one of the other industries that he asked for was a bakery that would receive covered hoppers for flour. So here is that industry at this point, with the storage silos beside the spur. And all the other industries have been left fairly generic, although this one has multiple car spots for different types of cars. I've also put a mechanic shop in behind the gas station, which is fairly common. I haven't detailed his high-level cityscape, figuring that it's far better to build card mock-ups to see what he likes in full-size 3D. Now at this point, I've drawn the buildings further back from the road than they need to be. There is plenty of room for him to run this track down beside the road if he decides he doesn't want the full street running. And obviously, if he does decide to keep the track in the street, these buildings would need to be enlarged so as to make it look as though there wasn't room to put the track beside the street. Oh, something else I did was I double-tracked the helix to reduce congestion. Operationally, the second track is just basically a long passing siding. But the other advantage of the double track is that the first lap of the helix can be built and serve as a temporary 2-track staging yard until he decides whether or not he wants to build the upper deck. Now in the container yard, although most of the stacking area is assumed to be in the aisle, I did allow room for a few container stacks at one end. And I've drawn a travelling crane at this point. Note how it's in the gap between the industries and far enough away from the yard ladder to be where it's not likely you're going to have to reach across it very often. Even so, being right at the front edge, it might be worth considering replacing it with forklifts, as is commonly done in smaller container yards. Anyway, I think that is just about all there is to say about this layout. Let me just show you one more view. Here is a much higher resolution drawing without all the annotations. So I will leave this for you. Please feel free to pause the video. Hope you've enjoyed the presentation, and I hope to see you again next week. Thanks for watching, and bye for now.